three big players, the U.S.,
Congressional
China,
Affairs at the Cato Institute, and I want to thank you all for coming out today. This is a Capitol Hill briefing entitled The Iran Nuclear Deal, Assessing the Impact of Decertification. First, if you're watching via C-SPAN 2 or our live stream and would like to join the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Please tweet us at hashtag CatoFP or at hashtag Cato Events. That's FP as in foreign policy. Further, we will be accepting questions from Facebook Live, so you may post there as well. This spring, the Cato Institute released the 8th edition of the Cato Handbook for Policymakers. Copies were available on the table as you came in, and there are well over a dozen chapters covering a libertarian or realist approach to various aspects of foreign policy and international relations. If you'd like more copies, please contact me after the program. And meanwhile, fully searchable PDFs, the entire 80-chapter volume, are available at cato.org. Also on your chairs is a new publication from our two speakers entitled Unforced Error, The Risks of Confrontation with Iran, which will augment and support much of the information we surveyed today. As many are aware, by Sunday, October 15th, the President will have an opportunity to certify or not the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. And the White House has announced a press conference for Thursday where he is expected to publicly formalize and justify his position, with all signs pointing to decertification. For Congress, this could mean a 60-day window to reinstate the sanctions that were suspended in exchange for that country's freeze on its nuclear program. From some quarters, this is meant to be a critique that the executive branch is simply foisting its responsibilities onto the legislative branch. But we see the possibilities more broadly than that and think the full range of implications have not been adequately examined. To explore these other likely alternatives to decertification, I brought two scholars from Cato who have been examining the available options very closely and have each co-authored the paper I mentioned that's on your chairs, describing the dangerous path before us. First up will be Emma Ashford, who is a research fellow with expertise in international security and the politics of energy. Her research focuses on the politics and foreign policies of petrostates, particularly in Russia and various Middle Eastern countries. Her dissertation explored the ways in which oil production and export shapes conflict, including ongoing wars in Ukraine, Yemen, and Syria. Ashford's recent research examines the extent to which international sanctions imposed on Russia have been effective, as well as their impact on U.S. and European businesses. Her work has been published in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, and many others, and she has been a frequent guest on television and radio. Ashford holds a PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia and an MA from American University School of International Service. Then John Glaser, who is Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. His research interests include grand strategy, basing posture, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the rise of China, the role of status and prestige motivations in international politics. Glaser has been a guest on a variety of television and radio programs and has had his work published in the Foreign Affairs, the National Interest, CNN, Time, Newsweek, The Guardian, among many others. Glaser earned a Master of Arts in International Security at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. And we will leave time for Q&A at the end, but for now, let's please welcome Emma Ashford. More clapping, more clapping.
Thank you. No, please, if you don't have a seat at the back, please feel free to come up and sit near the front. There's plenty of seats up here. So thanks to everyone for coming and attending this talk today. This paper concerns an issue that John and I are both very concerned about, many of our colleagues are very concerned about, and that is the question of what the Trump administration is going to do about Iran. And in the short term, that is the question of what they intend to do about the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And over the longer term, we think that includes the question of the Trump administration's approach to Iran more broadly. So if, as we all expect, Donald Trump announces later this week that he does not want to remain in the nuclear deal, that he is going to decertify Iran, we wanted to look at what happens next. So this report effectively examines the alternatives. We came up with 4 alternatives: sanctions, pushing back against Iran in the region, so-called regime change from within, and then direct military action as alternatives that the Trump administration could pursue to the JCPOA. And as you'll hear both myself and then John talk about this afternoon, there are serious problems with all of these options. And we think that these options should be discussed now up front before Congress actually weighs in on the JCPOA, presumably in the next 60 to 75 days. So Donald Trump has been hostile towards the Iranian nuclear deal since during the campaign. He made a number of statements on the campaign trail about tearing up what he referred to as a bad deal, a disastrous deal, the worst deal ever made. He never really issued any concrete criticisms of the deal, but he was always very clear that one of the earliest things he would do when he got into the White House was withdraw the US from this deal. And in many ways, it was actually somewhat surprising when Trump, upon entering into the White House, did not, in fact, withdraw from the deal. His administration has actually issued 2 certifications to Congress stating that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal. And this actually fits with the facts of the case. Iran is in compliance with the deal. The International Atomic Energy Agency has certified a number of times that Iran is in compliance. The US intelligence community agrees that Iran is in compliance. Even inside the White House, a number of the president's own advisors are very much opposed to withdrawing from this deal because they believe, as John and I both do, that Iran is in compliance with the deal. The voices against certification, the voices calling for the president to withdraw from the nuclear deal, often state that they have very specific concerns about the deal, small technicalities, areas where they're not 100% sure if it's working out. And if any of you have any questions on those, I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But rather than actually talk in depth about the deal and its pros and cons right now, I want to move to the next step and talk a little about why the deal is still the best alternative for dealing with Iran. And the debate that has happened inside the Trump administration and with a number of outside voices in many ways echoes the debate that we saw in the mid-2000s when the Bush administration was considering what to do about Iran. It is many of the same voices, people like John Bolton, who was George W. Bush's UN ambassador, who are arguing in favor of removing the US from the nuclear deal, taking a harder line against Iran, and in many cases seeking to actually overthrow the Iranian regime. So this debate about the JCPOA is not happening in a vacuum. But the Trump administration doesn't seem to have a clear follow-on. We have seen the sentiment stated that they intend to decertify, to kick this back to Congress, but thus far the indications are that the president may not even advocate that Congress actually reimpose sanctions. The problem is that if we do start down this road, none of the options are very good. And I'm going to start with the first option that I mentioned, which is sanctions. And this is the one that most directly impacts Congress, because Congress is going to be asked to debate after the president decertifies whether to reimpose the nuclear sanctions. If we do reimpose the nuclear sanctions, we will violate the JCPOA, effectively withdrawing the US from the deal. It is possible that Iran and a group of European states, and perhaps Russia and China, will remain in some similar configuration, even if it's not technically legally the JCPOA, but America will be the one that has withdrawn from the deal. And this leads me to the biggest problem with sanctions, which is the fact that our European allies are not happy about this at all. They are not likely to go along with reimposed sanctions. They are not likely to be helpful when we ask them to police their own companies that are doing business in Iran. And all of this renders the sanctions on Iran far less effective. If we go back to before the nuclear deal was initiated, what we see is a very wide, multinational, multilateral set of sanctions, some of them through the UN Security Council, some of them from the US, some of them from the European Union, including an embargo on Iranian oil imports into the European Union, all of which was very detrimental for the Iranian economy. If sanctions were to be reimposed, we would not have that level of support for them, and so it is likely they would be far less effective even than the sanctions that got us to today's deal. The other problem with sanctions, and I think something that we really don't talk about enough, is the fact that sanctions rarely work to produce policy change. The JCPOA is actually itself a very unusual case where we see sanctions actually succeeding in getting a country to come to the negotiating table. Far too often, as academic studies have shown, as many, many cases have shown, sanctions don't work. The Cuban embargo, the sanctions on Iran that we have had for the last 35 or 40 years, sanctions that we've placed on various countries in relation to human rights abuses, sanctions that we placed on Saddam Hussein's regime in the 1990s. Most sanctions regimes fail to actually achieve policy change. If we rip up the deal, we have no guarantee that new sanctions will produce a better result. It's far more likely that they won't. Let me move on to the second option that we examine in the paper. And this is the idea of regional pushback against Iran. So for those who haven't seen the reports, when President Trump makes his speech later in the week, he's going to talk more broadly about the US approach to Iran. And one of the things that he may bring up is this idea of pushing back against Iranian proxies in the Middle East, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Iranian-sponsored groups inside Iraq, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen. And the idea being that the US should work with friendly forces in the region, or indeed use US troops to actually engage with these and fight them on the ground. Sometimes it's described as rolling back Iranian gains in the Middle East. So again, in the report, we lay out that this is a very costly and very risky strategy. For the first part, there's no coherent opposition to Iran in the region. As we've seen recently with the Gulf state crisis, where Saudi Arabia and a number of other states have split with Qatar, there isn't really a coherent set of states that are currently opposing Iran, so there's no easy way to back them in this. There aren't very many good groups on the ground either. If we look at the Syrian civil war, the lack of any groups that the US could trust or work with prevented us from being involved in that conflict for many years. If you look at Iraq, some of the groups that we have been most closely working with, the Kurdish forces, are not particularly interested in this. So it would be very difficult to use local groups in this kind of regional military strategy, which means the burden would end up falling more heavily on US forces, which risks not just pulling the US into larger scale conflict in the Middle East than we already are involved in today, it also risks blowback to troops on bases in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere in the region. If the US engages in this kind of strategy, it is likely that Iranian proxies will take asymmetric action against US troops in the region, putting them in danger. So the strategy of regional pushback is likely to be more costly than the current strategy towards Iran. And I think perhaps most importantly, and this really needs to be emphasized, a strategy of regional pushback does nothing to solve the nuclear problem. It does not in any way address Iran's nuclear program in the way that the JCPOA currently does. So both of these first two options are more risky, which is to say they stand less of a chance of working than the current deal, and they're also far less likely to produce a result that we can be happy with. So with that, I will turn it over to John, who will go through the remaining two options.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for coming. I want to start by just reiterating some of the material that Emma opened with. I think it's really important for emphasis that I do so. And I want to be really clear about this. There's essentially a consensus that Iran is complying with this deal, okay? The International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed 8 separate times in detailed reports that Iran is complying with the deal. All of our European allies agree that Iran is complying with the deal. The Russians agree. The Chinese agree. Much of Trump's own cabinet agrees that Iran is complying. James Mattis testified to Congress the other day that not only is Iran complying, but that it would be dangerous and harmful to U.S. interests to back out or do anything to undermine it. General James Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the highest military officials in the country, said Iran is complying and that we ought to stay in the deal. General John Hyten, U.S. head of Strategic Command, said a similar message at the Hudson Institute a few weeks ago, One of the main points here is that it'll damage our credibility and trustworthiness in the international community if we can't be shown to be upholding the agreements that we ourselves designed and signed. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has also repeatedly conceded that Iran is in technical compliance with this deal. Under some pressure from President Trump, he's alleged that they're violating the spirit of the deal, although not the letter. To tell you the truth, I've read the text of this agreement. I've looked around for its spirit. I can find it nowhere. What I do know is that by complying with the letter of the deal, Iran has given up 98% of its stockpile of enriched uranium. They've dismantled two-thirds of their operating centrifuges, right? They've converted a number of their enrichment facilities to peaceful research centers. They've limited themselves to first-generation, unsophisticated centrifuges of only a certain number for 10 years. They've limited their uranium stockpile of 300 kilograms, nowhere near enough for a bomb, and at the lowest enrichment threshold of 3.75 for 15 years. There are other elements of the deal that restrict them for 20 and 25 years, right? And of course, throughout all this, they've submitted themselves to what Yukiya Amano, the head of the IAEA, and a whole host of non-proliferation experts have said is the most intrusive inspections regime ever voluntarily agreed to by any party. Okay? So what you might have heard about sunset clauses, the fact that, yes, indeed, some elements of this deal expire anywhere from 10 to 25 years from now. That's somewhat misleading because it's also true that Iran agreed to ratify the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which provides for expanded inspections, and that concession is permanent. Doesn't go away. So if Trump decides to decertify this week, he'll be doing so in defiance of the international community, in defiance of his own intelligence community, in defiance of his military advisors, in defiance of many members of his own cabinet, in defiance of some prominent members of his own party here in Congress, Senator Rand Paul, Senator Jeff Flake, Representative Ed Royce, who's chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, right? Crucially, if he does so, and it does undermine the deal, all it will do is incentivize Iran to drive its nuclear program back into the shadows, where it was before the JCPOA, and will forfeit all of the transparency and all of the visibility that we have as a result of this deal. So this is not just, it's one thing to look a gift horse in the mouth. It's another thing to ask the horse to turn around, face the other direction, and deliberately kick us in the sternum with both back hooves. This is the creation of a national security risk that does not currently exist. And if you have any doubt about that, look no further than what Bob Corker said to the New York Times on the record this week, which is that the daily task of Trump's national security team is to try to contain the negative impact he can have by flying off the handle and tweeting. Okay. The only hope, by the way, of mitigating the negative ramifications of decertification is if Congress decides not to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions in the 60-day window that they'll be provided with in the case of decertification. So let me get to the other two policy options that we explore in the paper. Emma talked about sanctions, why those aren't likely to be all that useful to us, pushing back against Iran in the region, essentially just a recipe for us to get bogged down in endless low-level conflict in the region. I'm going to talk about the policy supported by some of supporting Iranian opposition groups in the hopes that they could foment unrest in the country and possibly overthrow the regime. This is really a hopelessly infeasible project. The history of U.S. regime change operations is not very confidence building. They usually fail, and in the rare circumstances in which we are successful in overthrowing the current regime and establishing a new one in its place, it doesn't improve relations between the intervener and the country that we've just overthrown, right? It usually worsens such relations. A number of conservative and hawkish voices in Washington have argued for supporting the MEK, or Mujahideen-e-Khalq. They've done quite a good job in recent years of lobbying to try to depict themselves as liberal Democrats. Problem with that is that they have no support base inside Iran at all. okay? Also worth noting is that they were on the State Department's official designation of terrorist organizations until 2012. That's not a viable group for us to be supporting in the Middle East. One of the other groups that is frequently pointed to is the Green Movement. This is the sort of moderate reformist group that rose up in the context of the 2009 contested presidential elections in Iran. The reason we can't support them in hopes of regime change is because they have articulated no desire to overthrow the Iranian regime. In fact, they want to work inside the political system. And any whiff of support from the United States would quickly evaporate their domestic support base. So they're not a viable candidate. We really don't have any viable candidates inside Iran to try to support and overthrow the regime. So then there's direct military action, perhaps the most dramatic and drastic option. Hopefully the Trump administration is not actively pursuing this approach at the moment. But the first problem here is that a strike against Iran would be illegal, right, in both international and domestic law. I try not to predict things about Washington anymore, but I doubt that Congress is prepared to provide Trump with legal authorization to attack Iran. And of course, in the context of international law, you need either the justification for self-defense, which isn't present, or a UN Security Council resolution, which we won't get. So it'll be illegal. Second, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that direct military action could be a minor strike with limited consequences of the kind that Trump took without congressional authorization, I might add, in Syria earlier this year. There'd be no pinprick strike in this case. Escalation is essentially inevitable. Under bombardment from the world's most powerful military, Iran would be very likely to engage in retaliatory strikes. Their ballistic missiles can reach all the bases that we have in the region. They're very likely to engage in some asymmetric conflict with us via their proxies, etc. The Pentagon ran a war game in 2012, as they do throughout the region, to explore various contingencies. And they found that even limited strikes would lead to a broader regional war that would cost American lives and enormous resources, right? And nothing would persuade Iran of the need to obtain a nuclear deterrent more than a U.S. military attack, right? Not a viable option. Finally, think about the signal that we're sending to other countries, particularly North Korea, right? So we go and overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which, by the way, the IAEA was telling us at the time that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. So why don't we not ignore them again? That'd be a good thing. But also, we go in there, no weapons of mass destruction. How about Libya? We engage in negotiations with the Gaddafi regime to get him to give up his nascent nuclear weapons program, and he does. And a few years later, we go in and overthrow him with the help of rebels on the ground, right? And now, if we engage in this long, arduous process of negotiating concessions out of Iran to get them to roll back their nuclear program, and then we have a new administration, and he says, I'm going to rip up the deal, what country in the world, what rogue state, what potential nuclear proliferator in those circumstances is going to believe the United States that we can be trusted to uphold the commitments we make to negotiate back any nuclear weapons program that they might have or want? So look, as things stand, it looks as if Trump is going to decertify this week, and then, this is kind of cute, encourage Congress and his members of the Republican Party not to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions, as is their option after he decertifies, which essentially amounts to being able to channel and broadcast that he opposes this deal, but not violate it internationally. But I'm a little worried at how likely that is. Iran has said that so long, even if the United States backs out, so long as the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese stay in this deal, then they'll stay in this deal. But that is risky. It's politically not all that tenuous. If the United States decides to take a more hawkish and hostile approach outside of the deal, it's going to be very difficult for the moderates in Iran to continue to maintain that and stay by the deal. So I suppose we'll just go to questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, John. There's some thoughtful commentary on our Facebook feed. The first is about no-go zones. Are there zones in Iran now that the deal just doesn't cover, and what should we do about that? Is there a way for them to develop nukes apart from the JCPOA?
Okay, so I think what that question is referring to is this, this idea of inspections under Section T that has come up lately, particularly in some conservative publications. And the way it's often phrased is that we only have access to, a few sites in Iran. There are loads of other sites the Iranians could be doing, nuclear proliferation at those. We can't see them. This is both a vast oversimplification and not entirely true. So the section in question, Section T, primarily covers nuclear-related or nuclear weapons-related technology development that isn't related to enrichment. So it's not about enriching uranium, it's not about plutonium, it's the part where you would be like designing a weapon. And so this is in an appendix part of the deal, and it is in there primarily to say if we catch Iran working on any of these things, then that will be a violation of the deal. However, it doesn't have any inspections provisions, and as one arms control expert put it, it doesn't have verification provisions because it would be effectively impossible to verify. So this, for example, would include a requirement to look at every computer in the country that was capable of doing the mathematics that would allow you to research weapons on it. So this isn't feasible. It's primarily in the deal so that if we catch Iran doing something inappropriate, we can do something about it, we can raise it at the UN Security Council, and we can do something about it. In terms of where we can inspect, the deal covers a number of Iranian nuclear sites, at any of which the International Atomic Energy Agency can do inspections. The deal also includes provisions that allow us to present evidence of Iranian wrongdoing if our intelligence community figures out that Iran is working on something inappropriate at another site. We can present that evidence to the IAEA. They can demand access into it. If Iran denies access, they have 24 days in which to deny or grant access. And if they deny it, that's where we start to kick everything back to the UN Security Council. That's where we enter that whole snapback of sanctions discussion. So the deal has built-in provisions for if we have concerns about sites that are outside the deal. However, the Trump administration has not in any way presented any concerns that would rise to that level, which is why Iran has not been asked to open up other sites. We simply don't have evidence. We don't believe right now, the intelligence community doesn't believe, that Iran is actually doing anything outside of those sites.
Yeah, just in terms of visibility in general, I mean, I think there's somewhere between 30 and 40 sites in Iran that the IAEA has access to. Since the deal, they've conducted, I think, on the order of 450 inspections in the country. Again, we've been able to clear it. So there's some concern among some conservatives that in military sites where they might be doing research and cheating on the deal, doing it outside IAEA eyes, that Iran, we don't have visibility on those sites, but we have more visibility now than we had prior to the deal, and it's be a bad route to want to inspect Iran's country more by backing out of a deal that allows us at least the ability to conduct the most intrusive inspections regime to date.
Thank you. And I'll open it up to the audience now. Yes, you in the back.
One of the most compelling criticisms I've heard about the deal is what happens the day after the certification of billions of dollars in foreign funds. What incentive does Iran have not to begin proliferations anew?
So what you're referring to here is the idea that there are various provisions in the deal that sunset after 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25 years. So different provisions expire at different times. The soonest of those is around a decade from now, when Iran gets permission to start using some more advanced centrifuges. The thing is that is, again, an oversimplification of the way the deal works. So it is true that the JCPOA only stays in force for those 10, 15, 20-year periods. But after the deal ends, Iran has committed to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, including its additional protocol, which provides for inspections of their nuclear facilities. These are the same inspections that other countries go through when they have civilian nuclear power. And so, in effect, Iran has committed itself to abide by the JCPOA for the next 10, 15 years, and then to act as a member of the international community in good standing that has civilian nuclear power but does not want to weaponize it. It's not at all clear what Iran's incentive would be at that point to try and proliferate again. We would be back in the situation we were at that point prior to 2014, when the international community would be concerned about Iran's weaponization, and we would probably see reimposition of sanctions and other steps. So, despite what you might hear, there is no date upon which this deal just expires and Iran is allowed to possess nuclear weapons.
2 quick points on this. First of all, granting that it's a legitimate concern that once the deal has certain provisions that expire, we have to think about what to do next. Clearly, it's a good policy to, so long as Iran is complying, to continue to implement it and not deliberately back out, because we want to delay that prospect as long as possible. The second thing about what are Iran's intentions when this deal ends, that's hard to say precisely, but it seems to me that Iran has made a decision here. They've decided that they value opening up trade with the West, improved relations with Europe and the United States, compared to another fate that they could possibly pursue, which is to obtain a nuclear deterrent as a rogue regime with no allies and be aggressively sanctioned by the entire world the way North Korea is. And those are the 2 options that it kind of has here, and it's decided to take the former and not the latter. Now, that could always change. Doesn't mean we have to give up. Doesn't mean we should let up on inspections and so on. We should continue to have robust inspections there. But we should recognize that it's not necessarily the case that they're implacably in pursuit of nuclear weapons.
Yes, up here.
My question is in regards to, in the 90s, there was a similar deal with North Korea, where their nuclear program was going to be scaled back, frozen, and they were secretly and now admittedly still pursuing their nuclear weapons, to where today, a future generation later, about 20, 25 years, now I was 10 at the time, and now I'm dealing with it, where I'm at today. How is the JCPOA different in the sense that in 10 or 15, 20 years from now, we're not now going through the same thing with an Iran that might not have hundreds of nukes, but might have 20 to 50 nuclear weapons, where my kids are going to have to deal with that issue, maybe not with the 4 options that you mentioned today, but maybe like with the one that we're coming closer to with North Korea.
Right. So the 94 agreed framework, to call it similar to this deal is really generous. What it did was only focus on plutonium, not on uranium enrichment. And it was pretty limited. I mean, it was a decent enough deal to start with as talks progressed, as they did after the signing of the agreed framework. But it's nowhere near as invasive and intrusive and as comprehensive as the JCPOA. That's the first point. The second point is our behavior post-1994 is a good test case for how to behave with Iran right now, right? So there was allegations by Pyongyang that we were cheating. We didn't give them some of the benefits that we promised, provided that they complied. And then on the other side, there was some allegations that North Korea was violating the spirit of the deal, not the letter, by engaging in some uranium enrichment. That was at least the claim by the U.S. intelligence community at the time. But the agreed framework remained the basis for negotiations and talks and improved relations, even as there were problems with it, all the way up until President George W. Bush put North Korea in the axis of evil in 2002. And only a few years later, North Korea conducted its first nuclear weapons test. So again, if you want to describe our adversaries as implacably evil and sort of hint that we might one day come to blows and that diplomacy is not a priority for you, you might be engendering really negative reactions on the part of the adversary. Indeed, you might. But we don't need to do it that way. We can approach this on an incentive-based approach and incentivize Iran to act in good faith, and that doesn't have to end up like North Korea at all.
Plus, I think a better parallel than the North Korean issue might actually be some of the arms control treaties that we negotiated at the end of the Cold War. So if you look at the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, you look at the START treaties, SALT, these were treaties that we negotiated with an opponent, the Soviet Union, that we felt we couldn't trust, we knew we couldn't trust. The agreements were set up to include verification measures so that both sides could learn to trust one another. And those treaties, those negotiations, actually worked out fairly well in most cases. The JCPOA is more analogous to those than it is to the failed North Korean process.
Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, I'm Derek Harvey, and most recently the Middle East Director for the National Security Council. And I would hope we'd be able to agree that the major concern is Iranian behavior in the region, which has driven the focus of the President, not so much the JCPOA. Now, you drew out three very distinct and potentially serious actions by the administration. One is aggressively using military force, as Emma suggested, to roll back all the proxies. It's something I've never heard discussed. Two, considering military action against Iran, a direct military action, another thing I've never heard discussed in the administration. Or third, the idea that there would be regime change, which is ludicrous and has never been discussed in the administration up through July when I departed there. Now, that aside, what is a serious consideration for putting pressure on the proxies and on Iran is designating the IRGC writ large as a terrorist organization, which was passed by Congress and which is very likely to be part of the Thursday decision announced by the President. So, if that happens, that's putting pressure on that will impact a significant part of the economy, which will cause a reinstatement of sanctions across wide sectors of that economy. Now, that's not kinetic. It's pressure, and it should get our allies' support if we were to take them at their word that they're concerned about Iranian behavior, terrorism, and ballistic missiles.
You can go, and then I can go.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll let John handle the parts of that about what might be actually under discussion. But in terms of regional pushback, in terms of the other things that we should be concerned about, that we should be concerned about Iran's missiles, that we should be concerned about Iran's behavior in the region, the question is whether the JCPOA is part of the same problem. And the Obama administration, when they negotiated it, were very clear that the JCPOA is an arms control agreement. It is not designed to solve every problem in the US-Iranian relationship. It is designed to act as a brake on Iran's nuclear program and prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. The question of whether ripping up the JCPOA, therefore, would improve Iran's behavior in the region is rather a strange one. The JCPOA solves that one problem. And the question that we really need to ask ourselves is, would we prefer an Iran like today that is not got a nuclear program, that is hobbled by the JCPOA, but does things in the region that we are not comfortable with? Or would we like an Iran that does things in the region we're not comfortable with and also has a nuclear weapons program? That's the choice. It's not a choice between getting rid of the JCPOA, fixing all of our regional problems. It's a choice between a nuclear Iran that does the things they're doing today and a non-nuclear Iran.
Yeah, I mean, that was a sufficient answer. I suppose I'll punt on the question of whether or not these things are being discussed. You can read our report. Most of the time we're just arguing against what people have proposed, and it's not necessarily what the administration has proposed explicitly. It's a part of what other elected officials, former elected officials that have the administration's ear, think tanks in the town that have made these proposals. So we're arguing against a whole constellation of people that have made these arguments. Yeah, look, there's a chance that people who are really angry about Iran's other negative behaviors will be so angry about those behaviors that they blow up the nuclear deal in an attempt to get them to stop those behaviors, which is not going to happen. Those behaviors will only be exacerbated if we show Iran that we're not interested in diplomacy and that we can't uphold our commitments.
Yes, Joe.
Yes, can you please discuss the actual history, not of just the nuclear program in Iran, because Iran has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the history of the nuclear weapons program in Iran? When is the last year that there are strong, there's strong evidence that there was actual weapons activity?
The U.S. intelligence community has basically stated in 2003 that they believed that Iran had wound down its weapons program, and I am not aware of any update to that position.
It's actually 2007 they came out with a national intelligence estimate that said 2003 was the last time.
Yeah, thank you. So as of 2003, the year that the U.S. went to war in Iraq, Iran had wound down its nuclear weapons program. And after that point, the program was civilian. The Obama administration's contention, obviously, and the George W. Bush administration's contention is that the difference between a civilian nuclear program with so many centrifuges and a weapons program is largely intent. That's why the JCPOA focuses primarily on limiting Iran's ability to enrich enough uranium for a weapon. It focuses on their ability to get the technology necessary to do so. It doesn't so much address the question of whether they actually want a nuclear weapon or not.
Yes.
How would this decertification of the Iran nuclear deal affect Middle Eastern relations, specifically Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel?
So if the president chooses to decertify Iran, that step doesn't necessarily actually torpedo the JCPOA. That would happen if and when Congress decided to reimpose sanctions. And that would have reverberations that were felt in Europe, in the Middle East, but it would primarily be about the US and our European allies and trying to figure out what kind of sanctions the US was reimposing, whether European countries were going to push back against those or not. Countries in the Middle East, even those that are US allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others, weren't officially involved in the drafting of the nuclear agreement. I have no doubt that their ambassadors gave informal advice, but they weren't officially involved in this process, and they wouldn't be officially involved in any attempt to deal with the fallout of it. However, those countries could well see repercussions if Iran decides to retaliate in the region. So it's not at all out of the realm of possibility that if the US re-sanctions Iran, that we see further actions by the IRGC, we see increased funding to Hezbollah, other actions that we don't want to see, that these would impact US partners and allies in the region.
Just one last point on that. For those who are justly concerned about Israel's security, it's quite true that Netanyahu, the prime minister there, has spoken out very vociferously against this deal. But if you take the word of Carmi Gilon, who is the former head of Israel's internal security organization, and Uzi Arad, who is Netanyahu's former national security advisor, the way they characterize the Israeli military and intelligence establishment, they say that we're supportive of it on the whole. So it's Netanyahu and some political people who are opposed to it, but the intelligence and military and security apparatus in Israel is supportive of this deal for obvious reasons, because it staves off an Iranian nuclear weapon.
Yeah, they make a very similar argument to the one we're making here about U.S. national security, which is that Israeli national security benefits from having Iran in the nuclear deal, even if it doesn't solve every problem that Israel has with Iran.
Oh, we have one from Twitter, it seems.
So someone from Twitter wants to know, how good is a deal where Iran blocks international inspectors from military sites and continued development of missile systems?
So that's a good question. I think the question really is what is possible. Is a deal possible in which Iran gives up every notion of national sovereignty, where we would be provided with international inspectors, U.S. officials maybe, at all of Iran's sensitive military sites, all of Iran's intelligence sites, right? This assumes that Iran has no legitimate security concerns of its own, which it obviously does. It's a dangerous region. And it assumes that any country would give up that much of its own notions of national sovereignty. The deal as is the most intrusive inspections regime ever voluntarily agreed to by any country. That's according to Ariane Tabatabai, Georgetown University professor and non-proliferation expert. That's according to a letter signed by more than 80 non-proliferation experts a few weeks ago. That's according to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's not perfect, but in life you don't get perfect choices. You get least bad options. And the JCPOA is very clearly one of those.
With regard to that question, I also want to add that the fact that it doesn't cover missiles was one of the key concerns at the time when the deal was negotiated. And I think given Iran's continuing tests, that remains a concern. But as we argue in the report, and if you get a chance to look through it, you'll see that we argue at the end that the best way to deal with that problem may actually be increased cooperation, increased engagement with Iran on these issues. Hassan Rouhani was re-elected in a landslide not that long ago. He has signaled a willingness to talk to the US, to talk to our European allies about further issues that concern us. And it seems to me, it seems to us, that building on the success of the JCPOA to talk about these other issues, things like missiles, things like Iran's regional behavior, is far more likely to be constructive and to actually produce good results than going back to where we were before, where we didn't even talk to Iran.
Yes, Stu.
Is there any signal that European countries and the other signatories to the Iran deal are willing to talk to Iran to resolve the problems they have with the ballistic missiles while addressing Iranian national security, the grievances that Iran has, to coming to some sort of agreement?
Absolutely. The European Union, Federica Mogherini of the European Union, has already engaged with Javad Zarif, her counterpart in Iran, on a number of these issues. The Europeans have effectively already started this process of talking to Iran and seeing what the next steps for building a more constructive relationship would be. Backing from the US would actually make this a much more fruitful process and would go some way towards reassuring the Iranians that we're not just going to walk away from the deal.
Yes.
This question is about the inspections. You mentioned that as far as we know that they are in compliance. Why aren't Americans allowed to go in there and inspect these facilities? Like, why are we excluded from these inspections? Because that to me seems like an easy come and look, see for yourself, and then that right there.
The way the deal was negotiated basically put the inspections in the hands of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And to some extent, this was a concession. Iran didn't want just the US doing inspections. It wanted this to be a multilateral process. It wanted this to be many states that it was dealing with, not just one. And the negotiations were actually set up that way. We often talk as if the JCPOA was a US-Iranian bilateral relationship. It actually isn't. It was negotiated by the P5+1. That's the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany working with Iran to achieve this deal. And so the way it was negotiated basically put these inspections in the hands of the International Atomic Energy Agency to make their impartial assessment. That was the way that Iran felt comfortable with this. That being said, I think we would all be foolish to assume that the US intelligence community is not doing its own assessments of these issues. And everything that has been publicly stated about this suggests that the US intelligence community believes that Iran is in compliance too. We are not just taking the word of the International Atomic Energy Agency on this, we are also using our own resources to figure out if Iran is in compliance.
I should note that both Emma and John are available to you or your bosses if you want to go in more in depth in a private setting. We're happy to go to the offices and talk and do whatever you want. But yes, you have a question.
So Iran has said that if the United States were to back out of the nuclear agreement, the United States would face a very large response from Iran. What kind of response do you guys think that could be, and do you guys think that Iran's claims that it will respond in such a manner are credible?
So this is a mixed, because what Iran has said is that so long as the other parties to the agreement remain in the deal, so will it, even if the United States backs out. You might be referring to some comments which have been reported in the media by Iranian officials who say, look, if you destroy the deal, we'll start to build enriched uranium, we'll be unburdened from the restrictions of the deal, etc., and we'll do that. Others have said, look, our ballistic missiles can reach all of U.S. bases in the region. These things are true, but they're not offensive descriptions of policy. They're defensive. They're saying, look, if this goes south, and it looks like you guys are going to take a more hostile approach, we have options.
Can we take a few more steps down the path of if Trump decides to certify, or to decertify but not ask Congress to renew sanctions in 60 days? What does that look like in 60 days? What happens next if that's the path that...
Technically, we don't violate the deal unless we reimpose sanctions. So this whole certification business is purely a result of the piece of legislation that was passed in the aftermath of the signing of the JCPOA, and we don't formally sort of abrogate our involvement with the deal until Congress reimposes sanctions. So it could very well be the case that if Trump decertifies to broadcast his distaste for the deal, but works with Congress to encourage Republicans especially not to reimpose sanctions, that we could be fine. You know, it'd be, the deal would not be as strong as it is now, but it could still survive.
Because it basically takes us out of the process without...
No, not technically. It's basically just a presidential statement.
So then he would not have to sign again in another 90 days.
There have been reports that the administration and Rex Tillerson is going to work with Congress to try to amend or alter or revise the Corker Amendment that obligates the president to every 90 days certify or decertify. But that's every 90 days at this point. We'll have to maybe confront this issue.
Yeah, so this is the question of U.S. law versus the JCPOA that's an international agreement. And so the certification process is narrowly linked to that Corker-Cardin legislation that was passed in order to approve the nuclear deal. It doesn't actually withdraw us from the nuclear deal, as John says, until and unless Congress reimposes sanctions. And this is why any debate that Congress has in the next 60 days, or indeed if this issue comes up again in 90 days or further in the future, this debate that Congress will have is extremely important, because it is what will determine if the U.S. continues to uphold the deal or if we withdraw from the deal and effectively say to the world that we are not willing to continue to participate in this process even though all the other states are in compliance.
Yeah, last one, I think.
Yeah, could you talk a bit about kind of the actual process of how Congress would snap back the sanctions? Because the way I have understood from what you're saying, and pretty much I think a lot of people would agree, is that there's really no action that Iran has undergone to warrant the decertification. So what is the basis upon which Congress would be acting to snap back the sanctions? And then can you please talk about how that actual process works, because the way I understand it is an expedited process, and that the debate would actually be very limited, and that essentially the majority would be able to push it through very, very quickly. And
That's correct. So the way the legislation is written, there's no parliamentary tomfoolery that can go on. There's no filibustering. There's no cloture. It goes to a strict majority vote. And so, you know, given the the balance of the parties in the Senate right now, that's how it would go. So it'd be very quickly expedited. What is it? The leadership in the course of 10 days doesn't.
It's the relevant committees as laid out in that legislation, which I think is Foreign Affairs, Banking, Ways and Means. There might be one other. Check with me on what the one other is. But if the relevant committees don't advance legislation within 10 days, then it's up to the leaders of each house to advance legislation that would basically be an up or down vote on reimposing nuclear sanctions. In terms of the justification for it, there are two parts of the Corker-Cardin legislation. One is that the president is supposed to certify whether or not Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal. The other is whether the deal is in the national security interests of the U.S. And those of you that are familiar with legislation know this often appears in a lot of national security bills. And apparently that, it's said that that is what Trump is going to do. He's going to state not necessarily that Iran is not in compliance, but he's going to state that the deal is not in the national security interests of the United States.
Congress is based on their position on it. Is that, what, obviously that was
Politics?
Just, okay.
Congress would be basing their decision on basically that broader question, on whether they think that Iran is in compliance, whether they agree with the White House that it's in the national security interests of the U.S. to remain in the deal. But no, there's not a specific reason why Congress is considering this in the absence of any concrete evidence of Iranian.
Yes.
All right, any more? No? All right, John Glazer, Emma Ashford, thank you.
In about an hour, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster on the history and impact of the National Security Council on its 75th anniversary. He'll be joined by three of his predecessors, including Henry Kissinger,